Millionaire forced her son to marry a humble farmer. She almost fainted when she discovered that he knew the whole truth about her plan. The sun streamed through the large windows of the Stevens mansion, illuminating the polished marble and golden details that adorned every corner of the house. Matthew Stevens, at 27 years old, was enjoying another carefree morning, lazily sitting at the breakfast table. He was absorbed in a luxury car magazine, one of his favorite pastimes. For him, life was simple: parties, trips, cars, and unlimited freedom. He didn't know any other reality. Everything had always been easy and within reach. His father, Michael Stevens, had passed away 3 years ago, but that hadn't changed much in his routine. At least, that's what he thought. Control of the family fortune had passed to his stepmother, Daniela, an elegant and meticulous woman who, since Michael's death, had become the guardian of everything, including Matthew. The relationship between Matthew and Daniela was tense. There wasn't an explicit explosion of hatred between the two, but an unsettling coldness. Daniela had a calculated presence, always serious and composed. To Matthew, she was nothing more than a distant shadow, an obstacle he simply avoided, while enjoying the fortune that, in his mind, already belonged to him. However, Daniela didn't share the same indifference. In her eyes, Matthew was a threat. He was the legitimate heir, and in time he would take control of the Stevens empire, something she couldn't allow. Despite all her charm and polished appearance, Daniela was a deeply ambitious woman. And with that ambition, while Matthew relaxed without a care, she was already plotting her next move. In the silent office of the mansion, Daniela reviewed Michael's will once again. Although she had control of the fortune until Matthew turned 30, there was something that troubled her. He could still one day take the reins and dissolve the power she had worked so hard to maintain. To Daniela, that was unacceptable. Matthew, with his carelessness and indolence, was dangerous because, in his hands, the Stevens empire could be destroyed. And so she decided that it was time to tame him, to teach him humility, but in her own way. And Gabriela would be the key to that. Gabriela worked tirelessly on her small farm, a legacy from her parents. She was a woman with calloused hands, sharp eyes, and a strong heart. Since inheriting the property, she had faced numerous challenges, but hadn't given up. Every piece of land she cultivated was a reflection of her determination. However, the debts were piling up, and the days seemed to be getting tighter. When Daniela unexpectedly appeared on her property, Gabriela didn't know what to expect. The rich and elegant woman, with her cold and calculated demeanor, didn't fit at all with the simple and rustic surroundings of the farm. Daniela's impeccable clothes contrasted with the dusty ground where Gabriela spent most of her days. They were from completely different worlds, and that was uncomfortable from the start. "I know your farm is in trouble," Daniela said, her voice low and firm, making the words sound like a sentence. "I can help you, but I'll need something in return." Gabriela furrowed her brow, feeling the weight of what was to come. "What do you want?" she asked, the distrust evident. Daniela looked at her with a slight smile. "I want you to marry my stepson, Matthew." Gabriela felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. The idea was absurd, unthinkable. She barely knew Matthew, except for what she had seen in the media. A spoiled, wealthy young man who lived a life of excess and superficiality. It didn't make any sense. "This is impossible," Gabriela murmured, trying to understand the intentions behind the proposal. Daniela, however, continued in her cold voice. "You have no choice, Gabriela. Either you marry him, or I'll make sure your farm is taken. I have the means to make that happen, and believe me, no one will help you." Gabriela remained silent, feeling the immense pressure. It was like she was trapped in a nightmare. Her life, built with so much effort, was now in the hands of this woman. She could lose everything if she refused. "I'd need time to think," she said, her voice trembling. Daniela simply nodded slightly. Don't take too long. I don't have much time to wait." And with that, she turned and left Gabriella alone, with the weight of a decision that would change her life forever. Back at the mansion, Matthew received the news like a punch in the stomach. Marriage? With a farm girl? He laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "You've got to be kidding me, Daniela." Daniela, with her expressionless face, showed no reaction to Matthew's outburst. "You're at an age where you need to take on responsibilities, Matthew. This marriage is what you need to learn about life. Gabriella is a strong and honest woman. You'll learn a lot by her side." "This is ridiculous," Matthew shouted, his anger finally erupting. "Do you think you can force me into this? I'm a Stevens. I don't need to submit to your whims." Daniela just looked at him, as if she already knew exactly how he would react. "You don't have a choice, Matthew. Your father's will gives me control over your life until you turn 30. If you don't agree, the inheritance will be compromised. I can make sure of that." Matthew fell silent, feeling cornered. It was a perfect blow. His stepmother had played her cards flawlessly, and he, with all his arrogance and pride, had no way out. For the first time in his life, Matthew felt that the luxury and power that had always surrounded him weren't enough to protect him. He was trapped, and his only option, as much as he hated to admit it, was to comply. The morning of the wedding dawned grey, with heavy clouds that seemed to reflect the mood of those involved. The ceremony was set to take place in the gardens of the Stevens mansion, a luxurious and stunning setting, but completely inappropriate for what would be an event marked by tension and despair. Matthew stared at himself in the mirror of his room, the jacket perfectly fitted to his body. He looked impeccable, but his face displayed a mixture of frustration and contempt. The wedding, decided without his consent, had turned into a prison, and he felt cornered. Deep down, he still couldn't believe he was being forced to marry a woman he barely knew, Gabriella. Just hearing her name made him feel even more irritated. To him, she was nothing more than a pawn in his stepmother's Machiavellian game. While Matthew was getting dressed, on the other side of the mansion, Gabriella was in a simple room, putting on the modest wedding dress Daniela had arranged for her. It was beautiful, but it didn't reflect anything about her personality. Every detail of that day felt like a farce, from the ceremony venue to the man she was being forced to marry. She looked at her reflection, trying to hold back the tears. This wasn't the wedding she had dreamed of for herself. She was being forced to marry Matthew to save the farm that was all she had left from her parents. Daniela's pressure still echoed in her mind, like a shadow that wouldn't disappear. "If you don't marry him, Gabriella, you'll lose your farm and be left with nothing," Daniela had said, with a chilling coldness. And Gabriella knew it was true. The moment arrived too quickly for Gabriella, and she was led to the mansion's gardens. The decor was flawless, as expected from something organized by Daniela. Exotic flowers adorned the pathways, and a small group of high society guests gathered for what was supposed to be a festive event. But the atmosphere was strangely heavy. Everyone could feel the discomfort, even if they didn't know exactly why. Matthew stood by the altar, his fists clenched. His expression was one of pure resistance. He didn't want to be there, and his eyes followed Gabriella as she approached, her face rigid. When their eyes finally met, it was like a collision. Neither said a word, but the silence between them was filled with disdain and misunderstanding. Gabriella, for her part, could barely look at Matthew without feeling the weight of everything at stake. The man in front of her seemed like a complete stranger, an arrogant young man who had no idea what it was like to fight for survival. She could feel the distance between them, as if they were from entirely different worlds. And, in fact, they were. But now, cruelly, their lives were intertwined, and from the look in Matthew's eyes, she knew he wasn't happy about it either. The ceremony was brief, but each minute dragged on painfully. The justice of the peace officiating the wedding seemed a bit uncomfortable with the lack of emotion from the couple. The words he spoke about love and commitment sounded hollow, echoing in an atmosphere loaded with tension. When it came time to exchange vows, Matthew put in the bare minimum effort. His words were cold, automatic, as if he were just fulfilling an obligation. He barely looked at Gabriella as he repeated the vow. "I, Matthew, take you, Gabriella." He said the words, but his tone was icy. Gabriella, on the other hand, tried to keep her composure. She felt the weight of every gaze on her, but more than that, she felt the emptiness beside her. How could they be husband and wife when they barely knew each other? She repeated the vows in a low voice, almost as if she were accepting a sentence. When the justice of the peace finally declared them husband and wife, Matthew refused to meet her eyes. He offered his hand stiffly, just enough to complete the act, and Gabriella reluctantly took it. The ceremony was over, but both knew the worst was yet to come. After the ceremony, there was a small reception. Daniela, with her calculated smile, moved among the guests as if it were a genuine celebration. She was the only one who seemed truly pleased with what had just happened. Gabriella, feeling trapped in the oppressive environment, moved to a more secluded spot, trying to process what had just occurred. That's when Matthew followed her. He wanted to make it clear from the start what he thought of the situation. "Don't think this changes anything," he said abruptly, his words sharp. "I didn't want this, and I'm sure you didn't either. So, let's be clear. We're in this because Daniela wanted it, and I'll do everything I can to get out of it as quickly as possible." Gabriella looked at him, trying to control her anger and pain. She had no choice, and she knew neither did he, but his arrogance made her feel even more suffocated. "Do you think I chose this?" she replied, with unexpected firmness. "I'm here because I was forced. But unlike you, I don't have a luxurious life to go back to. If I lose the farm, I'll have nothing." Matthew stared at her, surprised by her sharp response. He had always seen her as a passive victim, but in that quick exchange, he realized that maybe Gabriella had more strength than he had imagined. That irritated him even more. He was used to being the center of his own life, and now there was a woman in front of him who, despite everything, didn't seem willing to just submit. As the couple exchanged their first hostile words, Daniela watched from a distance. To her, everything was going according to plan. Matthew was enraged, and Gabriella, despite her resistance, was trapped in the agreement. Daniela knew that Gabriella had no escape. The farm's debts were too high, and without the marriage, she would lose everything. The manipulative stepmother had built the perfect trap to secure her control. She approached the couple just to keep up appearances, with an almost maternal smile, but Gabriella knew that behind that mask of kindness, there was something much darker. "You two look so beautiful together," Daniela said, in a tone that sounded falsely warm. Matthew didn't reply, just shot her a look full of hatred before walking away. Gabriella, still shocked by everything, could only nod. Daniela leaned slightly toward Gabriella, her voice low and controlled. "Remember, dear, your farm depends on this. Be a good wife, and everything will work out." Those words weighed on Gabriella like a burden, and she felt even more trapped in the fate she hadn't chosen. The wedding was over, but the discomfort between Matthew and Gabriella was just beginning. Daniela, satisfied with how her plans were unfolding, walked away, while the newlyweds felt more distant than ever. The tension between them was palpable, and both knew that the coming days would be just as difficult as that fateful wedding day. Now trapped in a forced relationship, they would have to find a way to survive Daniela's manipulation, while trying not to lose themselves in the process. The days following the wedding brought an abrupt and unwanted change for Matthew. As soon as he arrived at Gabriella's farm, he realized the vast difference between this life and the luxury he had grown up with. The simple walls, the dusty land that seemed to infiltrate everything, and above all, the silence. There were no constant sounds of cars, phones, or people at his service here, just the wind, the animals, and the constant noise of hard work. For Gabriella, the adjustment was immediate, as this was her life. For Matthew, however, it felt like a form of torture. The farm was more modest than he had expected, and every detail of the routine reminded him that he was trapped there. The lack of comfort was a constant provocation, and Matthew, who had always been used to giving orders and being served, now found himself facing exhausting work and realities that deeply irritated him. On the first morning, Matthew was woken up by the sound of roosters crowing, a noise that annoyed him deeply. He was used to waking up in his soft bed, with the curtains being gently opened by the servants. Now, the sun flooded the room without warning, and the fresh morning air mixed with the smell of wet earth. He hated every minute of it. When he came out for breakfast, he found Gabriella already up and the table set. She didn't smile or make any friendly gesture. She just nodded her head, indicating the food: simple bread, fresh fruit, and strong coffee, all very different from the lavish meals he was used to at the mansion. "It's not much, but it's what we have," Gabriella said, emotionless. She was exhausted, but remained firm in her stance. To her, this was normal life. To Matthew, it was a sign that he was in an environment that didn't welcome him. In the following days, Gabriella started working in the fields early, tending to the animals and preparing the land for planting. Matthew, still reluctant, barely moved. He refused to help her at first, wandering around the farm with a look of disdain, watching everything from a distance as if he was above that reality. Every time Gabriella passed by, carrying buckets of water or pushing carts of hay, he looked at her with a mix of disbelief and disgust. "Is this what you do every day?" he asked sarcastically as he watched her get dirty while planting new seeds. Gabriella glanced at him briefly without stopping what she was doing. "If you want to eat, this is what I do." Her dry response left him speechless. He had expected her to try to please him or justify the work, but that wasn't the case. Gabriella was practical and to the point, and Matthew realized for the first time that he was dealing with a woman who wouldn't bend easily. It bothered him, but it also started to stir something different in him. Despite her strength and determination, Gabriella was also struggling. Keeping the farm running alone was already a hard task, but now she had to deal with Matthew's presence, someone who clearly despised that way of life. He did nothing but complain and wander around, as if waiting for something miraculous to take him away from there. Even so, Gabriella said nothing. She knew the farm was her only salvation. Every task she did had a bigger purpose: to maintain her heritage and her dignity. Daniela had put her in an impossible position, but giving up was never an option for her. Even with Matthew by her side, mostly dead weight, she persisted. She knew Matthew looked at her with disdain, but she tried to ignore it. The nights were especially difficult. Matthew slept in a separate room, and the silence between them was like a wall. Sometimes she found herself thinking about what her life would be like without the forced prison of marriage. But then she quickly returned to reality. She was stuck in that fate, at least for now. One day, while Matthew wandered around the property with his usual bored expression, he saw Gabriella struggling to drag a heavy bag of feed for the animals. Something inside him made him stop and watch for longer than usual. He had never really paid attention to the physical work Gabriella did. But at that moment, as she wrestled with the weight, something different sparked in him. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the guilt starting to form, but he walked closer. "Do you need help with that?" he asked abruptly, without real conviction. Gabriella looked at him for a second, surprised. She hadn't expected that offer from him. Matthew, the spoiled heir, had finally offered to help. "Grab the other end," she said, wasting no time. Together, they lifted the bag and carried it to the barn. Matthew, panting and sweaty after the effort, looked at Gabriella, expecting some kind of acknowledgement for his help. However, she simply nodded, as if it were completely normal, and returned to work. The fact that Gabriella didn't show any surprise or exaggerated gratitude intrigued him even more. For the first time, he felt he wasn't the center of someone's attention. As the days passed, Matthew began to watch Gabriella more closely. She never complained, never stopped. From dawn until dusk, she was always working. There was a silent strength in her that he didn't understand, but he was starting to admire, even if reluctantly. He, who had always had everything handed to him on a silver platter, now found himself next to a woman who fought every day to survive. However, his pride still got the best of him. Matthew continued to feel disdain for life on the farm, for the conditions he found himself in, and especially for the feeling of powerlessness that dominated every one of his days. He didn't belong there, he constantly told himself. But something was changing, even if he didn't want to admit it. Gabriella, on the other hand, also began to notice small changes in Matthew's behavior. He was still arrogant and full of himself, but there were moments when he watched the work more closely, as if trying to understand the reality surrounding him. However, Gabriella wasn't fooled. To her, Matthew was still an immature man, unable to handle the harshness of life, but like him, she was beginning to see that there was more behind his arrogant facade. Meanwhile, Daniela, from a distance, continued to monitor the situation. She knew Matthew was out of his comfort zone and that sooner or later he would give in to the pressure. To her, that was exactly what she wanted: to break him, to tame him, and to ensure that he never threatened her control over the Stevens family inheritance. She sent occasional letters, filled with an almost maternal tone, asking about Matthew's progress. But each one was a reminder that he was exactly where she wanted him. Daniela knew how to play the manipulation game better than anyone, and her invisible hand was always present in the couple's life. Life on the farm was hard, and Matthew was still fighting against his new reality, but something was beginning to change. Slowly, he began to see Gabriella's strength and started questioning his own role in that place. Gabriella, on the other hand, stayed strong, trying to deal with her own frustrations, and with the presence of a husband she still saw as a burden. However, the first sparks of change were starting to emerge. Time on the farm seemed to have its own rhythm, where days began before dawn and ended only when exhaustion took over. The first weeks after the wedding had been difficult for Matthew, who continued to resist the new routine. However, slowly, something in him began to change. Matthew now watched Gabriella more closely. His gaze, once full of disdain, was beginning to transform into something more complex. He still couldn't understand how someone could live like that, waking up before the sun appeared on the horizon, working tirelessly day after day without complaints. Gabriella was a silent force, and the more Matthew observed her, the harder it became to ignore her resilience. One day, something inside Matthew gave in. He could no longer stand his own inertia, and though he wouldn't admit it, there was a growing curiosity to understand what kept Gabriella so determined. He decided, albeit grudgingly, to offer help. "I'll help you with the harvest today," he said, his voice hesitant, as if still battling the idea. Gabriella, surprised by the offer, looked at him cautiously. She hadn't expected him to want to actually help, especially voluntarily, but knowing Matthew, she knew that any help from him would be clumsy at first. "If you want to help, great," she said bluntly, "but don't expect me to have patience for slackers. The work here is serious." Her words hit Matthew like a challenge, and he nodded, determined to prove that even though he was a spoiled heir, he could handle it. However, he quickly realized that farm work wasn't as simple as it seemed. His first attempts to help Gabriella were a disaster. He barely knew how to hold the tools properly, and his lack of skill was obvious. He almost knocked over a pile of hay, and when trying to lift a barrel of water, he ended up soaking himself. Gabriella, watching silently, couldn't help but let out a slight smile. Matthew, sweaty and frustrated, looked like a caricature of the arrogant man who had arrived at the farm weeks before. "You need finesse, not brute force," she said, her voice tinged with humor. "Nothing gets done in a hurry here." Matthew, irritated by his failure, huffed. "I'm trying, okay?" Gabriella just shook her head. "Trying is a start." Over time, Matthew's clumsy attempts began to improve. He still made mistakes, and the exhausting work left him more tired than he'd ever been, but something unexpected was happening. The forced time together with Gabriella, oppressive at first, now felt less so, though there were still long silences between them. Working together created brief moments of connection. One day, after an especially tiring afternoon, the two stopped to rest under the shade of a tree. Matthew, panting, threw himself on the ground, feeling the rough grass beneath him. Gabriella, with a less rigid expression than usual, sat beside him. "You look more tired than when you started," Gabriella said, not unkindly. Matthew laughed, a short but genuine laugh. "I didn't know farm life was so hard. I thought it was just planting and harvesting." Gabriella shook her head, a faint smile on her lips. "Things are never as simple as they seem, Matthew." There was a pause, and for the first time, Matthew looked at Gabriella differently. Not as the woman he had been forced to marry, not as the symbol of Daniella's control over him, but as someone real who carried burdens he had never imagined. "I had no idea how hard your life was." Gabriella turned to him, surprised by the admission. Matthew had always seemed so oblivious, so focused on himself, that she hadn't expected this kind of vulnerability. "And you think yours isn't?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. "I know you didn't ask for this. We're both trapped in a way." It was the first time Gabriella admitted, even subtly, that she saw something beyond the spoiled young man Matthew appeared to be. She was beginning to realize that he, too, was a victim of Daniela, stuck in a life he hadn't chosen, just like her. As Matthew and Gabriella slowly started to find small points of understanding, Daniela continued to monitor the situation from afar. Her letters arrived regularly at the farm, always filled with false concern, asking about Matthew's adjustment and offering veiled advice. Each of Daniela's letters was a reminder that even far from the mansion, they were not free from her influence. "You think she'll ever leave us alone?" Matthew asked, irritated, after receiving another letter from his stepmother. Gabriella shrugged, busy with a task. "She'll never leave us completely. That's just how Daniela is, controlling. She'll find a way to make sure we still depend on her." Matthew knew Gabriella was right. Daniela had created the perfect system of manipulation, one in which both of them were trapped, with no apparent escape. However, this realization was beginning to stir a desire for freedom in Matthew, something he had never felt before. For the first time in his life, he wanted to break free from his stepmother's control. With each passing day, Matthew started to respect Gabriella's work more. There was a dignity in how she moved and faced the challenges of the farm. He was starting to see in her a strength that had been invisible to him before. Gabriella, on the other hand, noticed that Matthew was changing, even if reluctantly. His arrogance diminished a little with each day that he got his hands dirty with hard work. That night, sitting together in silence after dinner, Gabriella broke the ice. "You don't have to be the man Daniela wants you to be." Matthew, surprised by the statement, looked at her. "And who do you think I should be?" She looked at him with a seriousness he hadn't seen before. Someone who makes their own decisions. Gabriella's words echoed inside Matthew. His entire life he had been guided by others, first by his father, then by Daniela. He had never had to think much about the future, about who he wanted to be, but now, for the first time, he was beginning to understand that maybe Gabriella was right. The forced time together between Matthew and Gabriella was beginning to show its first results. Though there was still distrust and resentment, both were learning more about each other, and in the process, more about themselves. Daniela, however, continued to manipulate the circumstances, ensuring that even with these small changes, Matthew and Gabriella remained under her control. Yet, something inside Matthew was stirring, a growing desire to free himself from his stepmother's shadow and, perhaps, build something different with Gabriella. On the other side of town, Eliza's house was her refuge, a place where she could hide from the opulence and manipulation that surrounded her sister, Daniela. Living modestly, Eliza had always been in her sister's shadow, accepting her position without much conflict, until now. In recent months, she'd been watching Matthew from a distance, and something about him was changing. The spoiled figure of the past was slowly giving way to a man who was becoming more aware and distant from Daniela's control. Eliza carried a dark secret, the truth about Michael's death. His sudden passing had in fact been the result of slow poisoning, carefully orchestrated by Daniela. Eliza had known this from the start, but fear of her sister had prevented her from acting. Now, with Matthew changing, Eliza saw an opportunity to right the wrongs of the past, but she also knew that the truth would bring devastating consequences for everyone. As she watched Matthew and Gabriella grow closer, Eliza saw a possibility. If she revealed what she knew, Matthew might finally be freed from Daniela's grip. But revealing the truth would also implicate herself as a complicit party, something she deeply feared. She knew Daniela wouldn't hesitate to destroy her if she felt threatened. Eliza spent sleepless nights, reliving the moments when Michael had begun to fall ill, unaware that his own wife was slowly taking his life. The guilt gnawed at Eliza, but so did the fear of Daniela, whose coldness and manipulative abilities were merciless. The doubt consumed Eliza. If she told Matthew the truth, she would risk her own safety, but perhaps it was the only chance to free him from Daniela's control. With each passing day, Matthew seemed to distance himself more from Daniela, but without the final revelation, Daniela would always find a way to regain control. Eliza began gathering evidence quietly, letters, documents, and small details that would reveal the truth about Michael's death. She knew she had to be careful, as Daniela watched her with the same calculating gaze as always. Eliza couldn't afford to make a mistake. The heavy silence of the farm was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up at the entrance. It was Eliza's car. She arrived with a serious expression, carrying a thick envelope of documents and a determination she hadn't felt in a long time. That day, Eliza had decided she could no longer carry the secret of Michael's death. The weight of that truth had been eating away at her, and seeing Matthew's transformation and his growing distance from Daniela, she knew it was time to tell all. When she entered the house, Matthew greeted her with surprise. It wasn't common for Eliza to show up there, but he noticed the dark air she brought with her. "Eliza, is something wrong?" Matthew asked, unable to hide the apprehension in his voice. She nodded slightly, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Yes, Matthew. There's something you need to know, something I should have told you a long time ago." Matthew watched her with a mix of curiosity and concern. He knew Eliza had always been more reserved, more distant than Daniela, but he had never suspected she was hiding secrets. Eliza looked at him, her voice now trembling, but firm enough to say what needed to be said. "Your father's death—" "Michael, it wasn't natural. Daniela poisoned him slowly, and I knew about it. She planned his death to take control of the fortune. Everything she's done, from manipulating the will to forcing you to marry Gabriella, was part of her plan. Matthew froze. Eliza's words hit him like a ruthless blow. Michael, his father, murdered? Shock mixed with anger, and his thoughts scrambled as he tried to absorb the revelation. The silence that followed was long and tense until he finally found the words. "What? Are you saying Daniela killed my father? And you knew?" Eliza lowered her head, ashamed and regretful. "Yes, I knew, but I was scared. She threatened me. I've been trapped in this horrible game for so many years. But now, seeing how much you've changed and how much Daniela still controls you, I couldn't stay silent anymore." Matthew stood up, his breath quickening as pain and indignation swirled inside him. It felt like the ground beneath his feet was crumbling. Everything he had lived through, everything he had suffered, wasn't just a cruel game of power, but the result of a murder. Gabriella entered the room at that moment, sensing the tense atmosphere between them. Hearing the truth being exposed, she was equally shocked, but her immediate concern was for Matthew, who now seemed on the verge of an emotional collapse. "Matthew," Gabriella said softly, touching his arm, "we need to act carefully. We need proof." Matthew looked at her, his gaze full of despair, but soon found an anchor in Gabriella's steady presence. He knew the moment of confrontation was approaching. He could no longer allow Daniela to control his life, and now, with Eliza's revelation, he had a chance to bring her down once and for all. Eliza handed over the documents she had gathered over the years. Among them were evidence of Michael's poisoning, falsified medical records, and even a copy of Michael's original will, showing clearly that Daniela had distorted his father's intentions. Matthew now had everything he needed to bring Daniela to justice. "We need to do this the right way," Matthew said, his voice still trembling with anger. "I'll confront her, but first, let's make sure she has no way out." With everything in place, Matthew returned to the Stevens mansion, accompanied by Gabriella and Eliza. Daniela was sitting in her office as usual, reviewing papers. She looked up when they entered, and for a brief moment, her false welcoming smile flashed across her face. But when she saw the determined look on Matthew's face, she knew something was wrong. "Matthew, what's going on?" Daniela asked, her voice controlled, trying to probe what was coming. Matthew stepped closer, holding the envelope with the evidence. His eyes fixed on Daniela, fury now tempered by calculated coldness. "I know what you did to my father." The silence that followed was sharp. Daniela remained impassive, but Matthew noticed the slight tremble in her hands. He opened the envelope and spread the evidence across Daniela's desk. The letters, the medical records, the will, everything was there, exposing the truth. Daniela looked at the papers, and for the first time, her mask of perfect control began to crack. "You always wanted control, Daniela," Matthew continued, "but now it's over." Feeling the ground slipping from beneath her, Daniela made one last attempt. She stood up, furious, and pointed at Gabriella. "This is her fault. That woman led you astray, pulled you away from your life of comfort. Her farm, I can ruin it all in a second." But Matthew, now more resolute than ever, shook his head. "You no longer have that power over me." At that moment, the office door opened and the police entered, accompanied by the family's lawyer. Eliza had already prepared everything. Daniela, realizing her reign was over, tried to resist, but there was nowhere left to run. Her crimes, including Michael's murder and the will's fraud, would finally be judged. She was led away in handcuffs, her face a mask of hatred and frustration. With Daniela out of their lives, Matthew and Gabriella could finally breathe. The farm, which had long been a symbol of sacrifice and entrapment, now represented a new beginning. Matthew, free from Daniela's control, decided to rebuild his life with Gabriela. He took control of the Stevens fortune, but now with a different perspective, no longer focused on luxury and extravagance, but on the honest work and simplicity he had learned alongside Gabriela. Together, they began transforming the farm, combining Gabriela's skills in the field with Matthew's business knowledge. The property thrived, and over time, the respect and partnership between them grew into something deeper. Eliza, for her part, found relief in exposing the truth. She knew she would have to deal with the consequences of her silence for so many years, but seeing Matthew free brought her peace at last. The farm was alive that spring morning. The sun filtered softly through the trees' leaves, the light breeze swayed the branches, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and fertile soil. It was a day unlike any other, the day Matthew and Gabriela decided to celebrate their true love, far from the manipulations of the past. Beneath a large tree, the same one that had sheltered their first shy kiss months before, a small altar had been set up. The tree, with its vibrant green leaves, had become a symbol of growth and transformation for both of them. It was there, in that very spot, that they had ceased being strangers, forced into a life together, and became partners, and now husband and wife. The guests were few and carefully chosen, close friends, farm workers who had become part of the family, and Eliza, watching from afar with a serene, discreet smile, happy to see Matthew finally free and Gabriela flourishing by his side. Gabriela was radiant in a simple dress, made of light white fabric that danced with the wind. Her hair was loose, adorned with small flowers she had picked herself. For her, the simplicity of the moment reflected the purity of the love that had grown between them, without masks, without games. Matthew, standing beside her, looked at her with a full heart. He who had once been a man lost in luxury and immaturity, now found peace and purpose by Gabriela's side. The farm life, which he had once rejected, had become the place where he finally found his true self, and more importantly, where he found Gabriela. Under that tree, in the open air, they exchanged their sincere vows. There were no obligations, no ulterior motives, just simple, heartfelt words, promising love, respect and partnership for the rest of their lives. When the officiant finished the ceremony, Gabriela and Matthew turned to the few friends gathered, and the sound of soft applause filled the air. Matthew looked at Gabriela with a smile, pulling her close. There, under the tree that had witnessed the beginning of everything, they kissed. Not as strangers forced into a union, but as two souls who had freely chosen each other to build a new life together. The farm, once a symbol of sacrifice, was now the place where they rebuilt their lives, not just as work partners, but as life companions. The wind whispered through the leaves, as if nature itself was blessing their union. And so, Matthew and Gabriela began a new life together in love, ready to face any challenge life might bring, now truly united. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.